Hey, I'm Abby.
And I'm Shannon.
And we're sisters.
My big sister Abby has a Master's of Divinity from Earlham School of Religion and has been telling me Bible stories for probably 15 years.
And my little sister Shannon has seen 13 versions of Jesus Christ Superstar and has read parts of the Sermon on the Mount. Together, we're bringing you fun facts, historical context, and Bible stories.
Well, Bible stories according to you.
No, according to you.
According to you!
This is the Bible.
According to my sister. Happy January, Abby.
Happy January, Shannon.
Middle of January.
Yes, it'll still be January when this airs.
Yes. You've had a good couple first weeks of 2018, I guess.
It's been fantastic.
It's been fantastic.
I really am enjoying not having to go into work every day.
Fabulous.
Yeah, though next week that has to change a little bit. But, yeah, taking time off, reading. I've read so many books. It's fantastic. And watched some TV shows, and the house kind of needs clean. But other than that...
It's good.
Yeah, and I went to a retreat this weekend, and went hiking, and saw really awesome, ice sculptures created by nature.
Yeah, because you're hiking in, the icy temperatures that we had a couple days ago.
Yeah, but if you keep walking, it's less cold.
It is less cold.
You actually start sweating.
Yes. So I'm super excited. Oh, wait, I have to say, we're going to go over to the Bible Story Corner now? When we were originally setting up what we wanted to do for this podcast, you threw out this topic, and I was really excited about it, but we wanted to wait a couple episodes till we had this podcasting thing down so that we could nail this and make it perfect. No. Close to perfect? No. Perfect. Yeah. So what is the theme? What's the theme, Abby? What do we got?
Bible basics.
Bible basics. And hopefully this will clear up a lot of my questions from the past ones where I was like, and what's the thing?
Yeah, so Bible basics. There are a number of times where I'd be like, okay, well, I have to go back and I have to explain this thing, or can I say this because I don't know if it'll make sense to everybody. And so I'm assuming if you are listening to this, you may or may not know anything there is to know about the Bible. So we're going with some really basic stuff, but hopefully it'll still be interesting even if you know some Bible basics already, because I'm going to give a little bit of historical context.
Which is what I'm most excited about, is the historical stuff.
Yeah. I will probably at a later date do a little bit more of just the historical context of certain parts of the Bible, but that gets really complicated really quickly.
Yeah.
And so laying the groundwork before that makes a lot more sense in my head anyway.
This is lesson 101 in our Bible class.
Pretty much, but if you don't know anything about the Bible, or even if you do, it might be more helpful to kind of give you some context for later on, or even just kind of so that's why it's like that, insights.
Great.
And then you'll add weird things on the side too, I'm sure.
I'll do my best. So where do we start? Where do we start with Bible basics?
I think we start at the very, very beginning, which is, what is this thing, the Bible? And in terms of more of a literary context. So
okay.
Yeah, so the Bible is actually a compilation of writings. And those writings we call books. And so it's not actually one book in and of itself. It's a compilation of books.
Okay.
So that's the first thing to actually know about the Bible.
So this is a chicken soup for the Christian soul. It's a whole bunch of people wrote a compilation of things.
Sort of. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't with the intention when they were writing to compile them like this.
Okay, so this is a compilation of all of the Star Wars books that you find in the library because they're written by a whole bunch of people at different times who maybe kind of talk to each other and kind of have a general idea of what the canon is, but...
Sure, yeah, that's actually a weird but possibly correct metaphor.
Okay.
There's some weird things that metaphor doesn't quite work with in some of the books, but in general, yes, that's a really good way of thinking about it.
Interesting. Okay.
So we have a compilation of books in the Bible, and those are divided into two sections.
Okay.
There's what Christians call the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Great. I follow you so far.
Right. So we're going to start with the Old Testament.
Okay.
So the Old Testament is a compilation of writings of the Jewish people.
Okay.
These writings were compiled probably, well, they were finished being written up by like the 3rd century BC.
So 300 years before Jesus, they had compiled them. They'd been written and they'd compiled them.
They had been written and, pretty much compiled because some Jewish people wrote a translation of these books into Greek.
Okay.
Called the Septuagint, which will become important later. So they'd kind of all been written and compiled by around the 3rd century.
So these were oral stories that finally got written down and compiled into something somewhat the Old Testament around 3rd century BCE.
Yes and no.
Okay. The no in that they weren't all oral stories, or the no in...
Yeah, so they weren't all oral stories.
Okay.
So what we call the Old Testament is a compilation of Jewish writings, and they kind of fall into 3 categories. So there's the first 5 books of the Bible.
Okay.
I'm just going to go with Christian language here for the most part, because that's
fine.
easier.
Yeah.
So there's the first 5 parts of the Bible, which is often called the Pentateuch or the Torah in Jewish circles. And those 5 books have traditionally, people have said, Moses wrote those books. Moses being a really important religious leader in Judaism. Now, actually, those were oral traditions from probably lots of different groups who were compiled together and mixed in together, which is why sometimes you'll have the same story being told 2 or 3 times in a slightly different way, like back to back. And there are some songs in there, we think like one of the earliest verses or passages in the Bible is a song in Exodus sung by a woman named Miriam. And so those first 5 books tell like the creation story and like really the creation of the Israelites.
Okay.
And then there's another group of writings, which are the prophets. That's usually what they're called. And those books, the stories of Israel as a country, or Israel and Judea as a country.
Okay.
Kind of like the creation of it being a country and then it actually being a country. So it kind of goes from like the creation of Israel up to about the Babylonian exile.
Okay.
So
cool.
Kind of, a few hundred years there. And it has books like Joshua and Judges and 1 Samuel and Kings and the kind of those books.
Okay.
The prophets also include writings by prophets. So Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel, the major prophets and the minor prophets all kind of get mixed in there as well. And then there's this whole other group of writings called the writings, because they don't really fall into any of those other things. So there's like the Psalms, which are songs. There's theological writing, kind of more like Proverbs or like Ecclesiastes.
What is that, a style of writing when you say Proverbs or Ecclesiasticals? So
that came out wrong. So Proverbs are like just like one-liners.
Oh, okay.
That are compiled together in one of the books of the Bible.
Okay.
And then Ecclesiastes is actually a book of the Bible. And it's probably most well known for like there's a time for everything, a time to be born, a time to die.
Yeah, the great old classic rock.
Yeah, exactly. Comes from, that book.
Okay. Are those books, someone who doesn't know where anything is in the Bible, interspersed between the other sections? I know the first 5 books they're together, but then you were talking about writings and the prophets are Psalms and... So
in the Christian Bible, it's different actually in like the Jewish religious compilations.
Let's talk mostly about the Christian.
Yes, but in the Christian, most of the history stuff's together, and then there's the Psalms and Proverbs, and then the prophets and some of the other theological writing kind of gets intermixed with each other.
Okay.
And in the Christian Bible, it was compiled the way it was compiled, and kind of more of like a prequel, I guess, to the New Testament.
Okay. Yeah.
So it wants to tell more the story of like, so God made the world, and then, there was the fall of humans in the Garden of Eden, and then, Israel was created, and then that's all leading up to the birth of Jesus.
That's really cool.
Kind of like the narrative. They would kind of the narrative arc they're trying to make.
Yeah, that they would go back and be like, okay, we have this story, now let's format the Old Testament to bring us up to the New Testament. It's interesting.
Yeah. That's what they're attempting.
Yeah.
Anyways. So that's the Old Testament, and I think I'll do the New Testament now, and then I'm going to talk about this other weird thing.
Okay.
That's connected a little bit to the Old Testament, but it's sort of its own separate thing.
Okay.
So the New Testament is really the story of Jesus, and then the birth of Christianity.
Okay.
and then ends with the book of Revelation, which is kind of thinking, I guess, more into the future. So, in the New Testament, it starts off with the 4 Gospels.
Yeah. I know these. Wait. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Yes.
Awesome.
And so...
and they're called Gospels because gospel means good news?
Correct.
2 for 2 for me. Yay. All right.
Yay. Now, do you know what the Synoptic Gospels are?
It's either everyone but John or John.
It's everyone but John.
Ah, okay.
There you go. Yeah, so the Gospels are divided into the Synoptic Gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Okay.
And they are ones that are very similar to each other. The current thinking is that Mark was written first, because it's smaller and it's much more just like the basic story.
Okay.
And Matthew and Luke, the idea is that they kind of like took that story or that writing and added on to it. So like you really like the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
That's not in Mark, but a version is in Matthew and another version is in Luke.
Okay.
And those 2 versions are similar but not exactly the same.
Okay.
So Matthew and Luke base their books on Mark and base their works on probably another writing out there somewhere. So they add on stories to it.
Okay, cool.
So they're all very similar. And then there's this book of John, which also tells the story of Jesus, but is a bit more mystical. Doesn't quite line up with the other 3 books. So there are really cool things about John and some not so cool things about John.
Yeah.
John is a bit more mystical. It was written later, so in as much as any of the Gospels are historically accurate, in quotes, it's probably the least historically accurate because it's trying to do something different. And since it's written later, Christianity is a bit more...
Isn't Jesus the reboot? Is this like the catchy Jesus Revisited?
It's written kind of more for a different audience. Because when Christianity started, there were all these different takes on it. So when it started, it wasn't even meant to be its own religion.
Okay.
It was kind of rebooting, if you want to use that word, Judaism.
Right.
Kind of saying the promises in the Old Testament of a Savior coming is Jesus.
Yeah.
Granted, that doesn't actually... That's a whole other issue. Sorry.
Abby getting sidelined. Wait, I could go into a giant rabbit hole of information. Okay.
Yeah, we're not going there.
Okay.
So there were these different people who were going out and preaching to different populations, and they all had their own take, right?
Right.
Of what this guy Jesus was. And some people were, very much like, it's just a slightly different take on Judaism. And there were some people who were like, this is in Rome, so they're like, they take it and they make it more a Roman religion and much more mystical. So it's much more like Greek and Roman culture. And then there's everybody in the middle who kind of like, you take maybe some of the Jewish stuff, maybe some of the more mystical stuff, and so I mean there's all these different kinds
in between. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it takes like hundreds of years to really streamline into what we think of as being the Christian church.
Right.
And so out of that, lots of different writings appear, and one of them being John, the Gospel of John, which is much more mystical. It was written to a group who was a bit more on the mystical side, and it was written when Christianity was divorcing itself a little bit more from Judaism.
Okay.
And so less of the Jewishness is in the Gospel of John.
Interesting. That whole
Sounds
thing.
like a lot weird.
Yeah.
It's
a path to explain how we got John, which is not a synoptic gospel. Okay.
Pretty much. And hundreds of years later, when they are trying to coalesce what the Bible is going to be, it was obviously a very important text to a lot of people, not just on the mystical extreme of Christianity, so it got in there.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the Gospels.
That's the Gospels,
And then
right.
there's...
Which is what I
there's
know most about, so that's maybe
Yeah.
why we got sidetracked on it the longest.
Yeah. And then there's the book of Acts, which is part 2 of the book of Luke, because it was written by the same author.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, and it really tells the story of the first few disciples and apostles who are going out and preaching the message. So it's really what we understand of the origin stories of the first Christians is really right through there. And then we have all the letters, which again tell us what the early church was like, but in a more personal sort of way. Mm-hmm. And then we have the book of Revelation, which was written by someone named John.
Someone named John, that's everybody.
Yeah. Well, we're not sure, like, if it's the same John who wrote say the Gospel of John or the letters of John. So possibly the same person, possibly not the same person. And the book of Revelation is, he has been exiled onto the island of Patmos for being a Christian. And he has this vision, a very dramatic vision. It's in the genre of apocalyptic literature.
The genre, the dream that would launch 1,000 TV shows?
Not exactly. There's this whole, like, section of literature called apocalyptic.
Okay.
And this falls into it. So it's really thinking...
Wait. There's a whole section of writing called apocalyptic...
Apocalyptic.
Whatever.
Yes.
Apocalyptic literature. That was written at that time?
Written at that time, and even a few hundred years before that.
Okay. Wow.
Because apocalyptic literature is, to a certain extent, looking to the future, but it's also very symbolic, and it was written by people who were who were oppressed. They were living under occupation. And so it can also often kind of be seen as literature about bringing down empires.
This is just biblical dystopian literature.
Yeah, totally in a way.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like to me, because it's, in a way, telling the story of trying to tear down whatever empire is oppressing them at that particular time. And we make up empires to tear down, but they often have, there's often things about them that you're like, oh, I see that in my everyday life.
Yeah.
Yeah? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's like the book of Revelation, a lot of people read it as literal, this is what's going to happen in the future.
Right.
Which is one way of reading it. But there's a whole other way of reading it symbolically, of what are they trying to say about the time that they're currently in, and what are they looking forward to. And the narrative of the book of Revelation is that Jesus is going to come back and liberate us from the not great situation we are currently in. The New Testament ends with this idea of Jesus coming back. So the beginning of the New Testament is Jesus is being born, and the end of it is Jesus is coming back.
This is some great literature, man. You got everything in it.
You do have a little bit of everything.
You've got, like, the good guy to root for and his, like, sidekick buddies, and it ends with tearing down an empire and the return of something great. Like, they know how to construct a narrative.
Yeah, and that's the narrative that they construct. And I guess I should say the New Testament is made up of, like, 27 of these books that kind of tell this narrative.
Yeah.
Some of them being very short, some of them being longer. But it's kind of done in this 27-book narrative.
Cool.
So those are the two main parts of the Bible.
Okay,
But
I want to know about
weird,
this weird thing. Okay.
This weird thing. So I didn't mention how many books were in the Old Testament.
Right.
Most people, specifically most Protestants, would tell you that there are 39.
Okay.
But not all Christian denominations would say that.
Okay.
Because there's this weird thing called the Apocrypha, or the Deuterocanonical books.
I'm not going to even try to repeat those words.
Yeah. So, remember at one point I mentioned the Septuagint, the Greek translation of, like, the holy text of Judaism?
Yes.
It's called the Septuagint because there were 70 people, supposedly, who helped translate it into Greek, if memory serves. So, the Jewish leaders at that time when it was written, so sometime around the 1st century BCE, Jewish religious leaders got together and crafted and compiled a whole bunch of the religious texts that had been written. Most of those are what's in the Old Testament now.
Great.
And then around the year 90 CE or AD, after Israel really wasn't going to ever be a thing again, because they had rebelled and Rome had just crushed them, and they pretty much had to go in the diaspora that they are kind of currently in, kind of spreading across the globe. The Jewish leaders at that time kind of got together, and we looked at the books in the Septuagint, and they said 39 of them were the ones that were considered really, I'm trying to think of, like, the best word to use, not more important, but kind of like what they were kind of
the core, the essence.
Yeah, maybe the core, the one that they kind of felt were maybe more not as more important, or the
strongest reflection of their faith. I don't know what you're getting at.
Maybe like the complexities of why I'm trying to find the right word will become obvious later, because 39 of these books they felt like were really going to be what is now what they call the Tanakh.
Okay.
They're religious writings. But there were a few books that were in the Septuagint they felt like were important for people to read, but weren't maybe as important or as core as these other 39 texts.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. In Jewish tradition, they have like their core texts, but those are not like holy in the way that Christians see the Bible as holy. Those are to be read in relationship with other texts and other Jewish traditions and writings.
Okay.
So part of those other Jewish texts and writings were some that they took out of the Tanakh, but still kept as a separate section of books that were important. And there were about 8 to 9 of those books, plus a few like small additions to a few books that they kept.
Okay.
And those books are the Maccabees, which holds the story of Hanukkah and like one of like the last brief rises of Israel being a nation and then kind of their fall, along with a few other like small stories and additions to the book of Daniel and Esther, which are books in the Old Testament. These books are a little bit more fantastical in some ways.
Yay!
Because really, they talk about angels and archangels and dragons and...
Dragons? Are you serious?
Dragons. Yeah, there's a added section to the book of Daniel where they're kind of, fighting dragons and stuff. I haven't actually really read these books very much, so I don't have a lot of context to them, though it's on my to-do list because they sound amazing.
Yeah, that sounds like my jam.
I went to a Protestant seminary, so we didn't spend a lot of time on those books.
No.
Which will make sense in a moment.
Okay.
So these books are a little bit more fantastical in many ways, or they didn't seem quite as important as some of the earlier writings, and so they were left out.
Yeah.
And so I was just telling you right there about Jewish tradition.
So what's...
So what does this have to do with Christianity? Yeah. So they were trying to compile what was going to be in the Bible over a few hundred years. The Old Testament writings are from around the year 50 to around the year 100 AD or CE. But it wasn't at the year 100 that all of a sudden, these are the 27 books we read. No, it wasn't until about the year 396 or 397 when there was the Council of Carthage, when they kind of said, okay, these are the books. But even before that, you saw a different list of what books people thought were important.
Okay, cool.
So it was around the year, 396, 397, when they had this council and kind of said, okay, these are the 27 books that we think all the churches should be reading. They can read other books, but these are the final list.
All right.
And around the year 400, they asked a man by the name of Jerome to translate these texts into Latin, because that was the main language at that time, because it was still Rome.
Okay.
So Jerome used the Septuagint to translate the Old Testament into Latin.
Okay.
So what was he supposed to do with these books that the Jewish leaders were like, we're not so sure about those. So what he did was he translated all of it. The books that the Jewish leaders took into the Tanakh and the ones that they didn't. He just got a note over the ones that didn't make it as this is an additional text.
Okay, I'm following. Yeah.
Following, okay? And so that stayed, the Old Testament had all of these additional books because it was really, the Christians really only had the Latin translation for hundreds of years.
Yeah. So we're talking about around the year 400 he translated this. What's going on in a historical sense? Has Rome fallen yet?
In a historical sense?
No, Rome is still around, right?
Rome is still around, and Rome, just in the 4th century, the 300s, Constantine, the emperor of Rome, became a Christian and made Christianity the official religion of the empire. And so Christianity at this point is becoming more popular, they have more power, and they're really trying to start to solidify what it means to be a Christian.
Great. Okay.
And really trying to become one unified church as opposed to all these other branches.
So you need this Latin translation of the Bible. Okay.
Of the Bible.
Yes.
Yes.
Great.
And so this Latin translation has these additional texts, what the Jewish people would consider additional text. And at the beginning of each of those books, there's a little note saying this is an additional book.
Great.
Well, those books get handwritten. That's how these books get continued. And some people put in that little addition, and some people don't put in that addition.
Yikes.
Right? They still handwrite the books, but they don't say this is an additional text.
Okay, so the little asterisk that says this is an additional text disappears.
Yeah.
Okay.
Disappears
Right.
in some books, stays in other books, depending on who's transcribing.
Yeah. Right.
So periodically they'll have councils and or get-togethers and say, yep, we're going to keep these books in the Bible. But then the Reformation happens, right?
Reformation being, I don't know anything about history.
Yeah, the Reformation being almost 500 years ago. Was in 1517 when Martin Luther goes and nails the 99...
Oh, that's all it
this
is?
list of 99 critiques onto a church door saying, these are 99 things that are wrong with the Catholic Church. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, but from that, a whole bunch of people say, no, you know what, you're right. And we're no longer going to be Catholics. We're going to be Protestants.
Yeah. Okay, so that's where we get the Protestants.
And there's a lot more to it than that. I mean, that's like such a simplified version.
Yeah.
It's almost painful. But essentially,
yeah.
A second major split in Christianity happens at that point. An earlier one happened around the year 1000. So Martin Luther wants to translate it into German, which is the language he speaks. And so he runs into this problem of, do I keep these additional texts or do I take them out? And he was not a huge fan of them, so he took them out of the Old Testament and then added them at the very end with he called them apocryphal, like additional text. We call them more deuterocanonical now, just as it's a politer word.
Okay.
Essentially, the deuterocanonical is extra, apocryphal is more like not true or not good.
Well, I don't know what apocryphal means, but when you say it in my brain, I'm like, doesn't that it like pulls up an image of wrong? Apocryphal. Yeah. Anyway, so side note.
Those are kind of like the two words for it. So pretty much from that time forward, Protestants either don't have it in their Bibles at all or have it in a separate section at the end of the Old Testament.
Okay.
Now, the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, by and large, felt that those texts should stay in the Old Testament and were worth reading and worth keeping there.
So the Catholics get to keep the dragons?
The Catholics get to keep the dragons, which makes sense because they have all the saints and all the angels that they pray to.
I might be wrong, but it just seems like they're more mystical and they have a lot more of the kind of the magicalness around it.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah. And I think the Eastern Orthodox added a few other things that the Catholics maybe took out. I don't know that history as well. But so the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholics have a different order of books in the Old Testament, and therefore a different number of books in the Old Testament. Okay.
So that's why. So we have the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the...
And so that is the Apocryphal or the Deuterocanonical.
That's cool.
Additions to the Bible.
All right. Yeah. One of the last things we need to talk about is why is the Bible set up the way the Bible is set up now? Because you just talked about all of these books in the Bible, but there's always these numbers. If you say like John, number.
Yeah. So there are books, and within those books there are chapters and verses, but those were not originally in the Bible. Those chapters got inserted by, think about the 13th century, and the verses got inserted by like the 16th century.
Okay.
And the only reason is that it's easier to find passages in the Bible if you have chapters and verses. And sometimes verses cut off mid-sentence, sometimes they don't, and so.
Was that the system that was common then?
No. So the idea around books, they were writings, and they were writings that were on scrolls.
Okay.
Originally, I think, papyrus. And so you could only make a scroll so long. And so, like, one scroll would be a book, is what we now call a book.
Gotcha. So that's why we have Acts 1 and 2 or whatever?
There's only the book of Acts.
Never mind.
You have, like, say, 1st and 2nd Kings, right?
That one's one that has 2 books.
Yeah, so 1st Kings is like one scroll, and 2nd Kings is a second scroll.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And so they had that, and then when they had things on more like paper or vellum, they could more easily compile them, but it was still hard to, like, if you were trying to reference a specific passage, it was harder to find, so they inserted chapters, and then later on they inserted verses just to make it easier to find all of those things.
So it was all just convenience.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Pretty much.
I mean, in college we had to we had to individually write in numbers next to all the verses in our Ulysses book. No. Odysseus? Yeah, whatever. Our Homer, the Odyssey, we had to number them all in.
Yeah.
So that's what happened there.
So a similar idea, yeah. Which is very helpful into finding passages. On the other hand, it's like it breaks it up into like weird segments, and so we tend not to read it in the flow that it was originally intended to read.
Yeah.
And also, lots of places it was intended to be oral history and not written history.
Right. Gotcha.
Especially in the Old Testament, so the flow doesn't work as well anyways.
All
But
the time, yeah.
so it's interesting if you kind of like read a whole book the whole way through instead of just like, I'm going to read chapter 1.
Of such and such a
Of
thing,
said
yeah.
book.
Because it all ties
Yeah.
in, and it's a longer thing. Breaking it down in half. Okay, my other question is, you talked about translations a little bit last week, but when we're looking at translations now, are they mostly translations from the Latin? Are they translating from the earliest version they could find? Is it?
It probably depends on who's translating.
Okay, so you listed.
I think most people.
You listed two.
I think most people
translations.
try to go with like the earliest version that we know of.
Okay.
Those versions are usually, well, depending on what they are, we can usually find an earliest version in like the 3rd or 4th century for a lot of texts.
Okay.
And so those would most likely be like a Greek or a Latin
Okay.
Translation, and then translating it into whatever language is now.
Right. So, okay, are there any other things that you think would help clarify the Bible? Because we talked about the Old Testament, New Testament, the Middle East stuff, and then the chapters and how it's broken down.
And the verses, yeah.
But I feel educated. I feel much smarter now.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean...
So I feel like I learned a whole bunch.
Yeah.
And in the future, I won't have to ask you basic questions about how many books there are in Acts. Anything that I might have wrong.
Yeah, well, that was the point, and yeah, hopefully, yeah, it was a little bit enjoyable.
It was totally enjoyable.
Next week we'll get to Bible stories again,
Okay.
and I promise a Bible story.
Okay, awesome. Well, that'll be nice, I guess.
Which brings us to silly things with Shannon, or silly stuff
Silly
with
stuff
Shannon.
with
Silly
Shannon.
stuff with Shannon.
Yeah. So speaking of Bible stories, Abby kind of does the traditional Bible stuff, and then I really like to find current media about the Bible. And Abby sent me this show, which is on Netflix. It's AD, and on Netflix they call it Kingdom and Empire. When I Google it, it's The Bible Continues.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it has two names. So I wonder, it originally aired on NBC, so I wonder if it aired as The Bible Continues, and then Netflix needed to like punch it up or something and called it Kingdom and
Maybe,
Empire.
I don't know.
Well,
I mean, I was like searching Netflix the other day and like, oh, I like history things, obviously. Like, oh, that looks interesting. I'm like, hold on, this is about the Bible. Like, no idea from like looking at the title. I'm like, I didn't tell Shannon this, and I'm like instantly texting her.
well, this is where we differ, because I would totally watch that, but it looked historical, and so there was no way I was going to click on it on Netflix and find it. Like, Jesus would have to be in a spaceship for me to accidentally click on that show. So it's AD Kingdom and Empire, and then so this is actually a sequel to an earlier show they did, which was just the Bible, and I don't know anything about that. Anyway, I've watched a couple episodes, and I'm very excited about it, and I will watch more and tell you more. But
yeah. But, like, so I haven't seen it, and I've been, like, waiting for her to tell me about the show, and she won't.
I tried to text you some updates, and then I accidentally texted someone from our church, and it was embarrassing, so I stopped texting.
Yeah, so pretty much I know something about Jesus has hair, which surprised me because it was Jesus after Jesus died.
So
but anyway,
that was
so
really
yeah,
neat.
you know.
Oh, I guess I should explain Herbal Essence Hair Jesus. He comes back, and, you know, like, up in heaven, Jesus took a shower, so he's not, like, bloody. He's got the holes in his hands. But in, like, every version of everything, Jesus always comes back super chill and stoic, like surfer bro, with this beautiful, flowing herbal essence hair. Like a shampoo commercial. Oh. And I just, everyone else is like a phenomenal actor. They're killing it. And then Jesus comes in, and it's just like, I can't help but giggle because he's just so religious and stoic. I can't help it. It's weird, but he had he had very nice hair.
I'm glad he had very nice hair. But anyway,
so this is called AD. So obviously it's Anno Domini. Nope, that's not right. After death. What does AD stand for?
No, the Latin always eludes me. Like, I think it is like Omino Domine.
Anyways,
but it means like the year of our Lord.
Year 0. And so this is Acts. Like it follows this.
Okay, no. Okay, so historical context. Sorry. Year 0 is the year Jesus is born. Jesus supposedly dies in 33 AD because AD.
You're right. I knew I was going to mess
Domine
this up.
is about translation is the year of our Lord, not after death. Continue.
Okay, AD. But anyway, yeah. But the show is called AD, and it didn't start at 0. It starts at year 33.
I can't tell you what the people at NBC or Netflix were thinking. I can just tell you from the historical context, that is what it means.
Thank you. Got that cleared up. Now you'll have to clear up something else, because the show apparently follows the book of Acts.
Mm-hmm. Which you just learned about.
Which I just learned about, and I also learned that it's not 2 books. But it's really cool to see, like, there's things going on with Pilate, and things going on with Caiaphas, and they're trying to cover, like, is it true that there was this whole kind of cover-up, like, during this whole fiasco, I don't even know how to describe this. Like, they killed this person that a lot of people thought was the Messiah, and if he comes back, then it proves he's the Messiah. So Caiaphas and Pilate are trying to make sure that nobody can steal his body and pretend like he's come back. But he does it anyway. And so Jesus is back, the body's missing, and now what are Caiaphas and Pilate gonna do? Because they stuck guards in front of his tomb and everything. So is that true? That
So,
you know of?
I mean, Caiaphas and Pilate really don't make a reappearance kind of after their initial things in the Gospels. They did put, at least if I remember correctly, in some of the Gospels, they did put soldiers in front of the door, but they, like, went to sleep or they ran away when an earthquake happened that kind of moved the stone away from the tomb.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I mean, I think there were some fears that people had just moved his body. I can't remember where, but I think that was a thing. But, I mean, in general, the political stuff around that kind of disappears because the more important narrative is people believing in Jesus in the Bible story.
That was definitely a huge part of this story, is Pilate and Caiaphas are almost protagonists as they kind of weave the story about how they're going to try to cover up this fiasco.
Yeah, I mean, that makes it for a much better story, and
of,
I'm sure there was kind of like a what's going on kind of thing, but...
Yeah. And I asked that because the same thing was going on in that movie I saw 2 years ago.
Yeah.
The same, like, political intrigue. So I was just curious if that was real. Yeah. And I think that probably covers everything I need immediately to tell you about.
Okay.
AD Kingdom and Empire. Okay, so I guess that brings us to our final question that we finish every podcast with. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, so Abby, what is the Bible?
Well, apparently you weren't paying attention. So, the Bible is actually like a compilation of literature that we call books. And there are 2 sections. There's the New Testament and the Old Testament.
Through our 3rd episode. I'm really excited about that. So just the final notes for this. We want to thank Stefan Kartenberg again for making Gutaleli's Happy Place featuring Care Square, which is the music we used for our intro and outro. The link to their music is on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Bible Sisters. We are also on Twitter. You can reach us there at Bible Sisters. That's all for this week. We will be back on January 31st. Please tune back in.